Evidence against Professor Ferguson, images 114 to 172. These are the supporting images for a document comprising our evidence against Professor Ferguson of Imperial College for his ICCRT Report 9 Figure 1A, 510,000 UK deaths. Note to censors, we use only government data. If you have a problem with the results, speak to the government. These are images to support a prosecution, actual or available as required. As such, they do not purport to form a narrative in the sense of an ordinary presentation or video. Images are typically grouped by a topic. An image number is associated with each image. Each image has a slide with a smaller image and a brief text to provide context, and a following slide with the image in full screen. A copy of our written testimony will be in the video description. At the time of writing, it is available at the following link. We have over 290 images at the time of writing and will present approximately 50 images per presentation or PDF. A link to the PDF will appear in the video description. Images are free to use and share, but we retain copyright. Images with COVID data are based on official government data. Use wisely. Attempting to misrepresent our work, either to overstate the case against the government or to discredit our work or person, may be treated as defamation. The slides in a listing. Understanding Ferguson's approach using a reasonable metaphor from real life. In ICCRT R9, Professor Ferguson PF refers to setting up his model, which was seeded with a doubling time of 5 days. Let us understand what he was proposing to do. First, we align a cannon inclined up so that after 5 meters, the ball at 1 meter passes 2 meters. PF then sets up his target as reproduced deaths in the GB by 14th March 2020. So there is some uncertainty, but that appears to be at least 35 deaths per 15th March Metro article. So he aims for deaths 35 meters high, 69 days later, 69 meters horizontally. Our simple analogy has two problems. Exponential viruses, if such existed, go up, whereas cannonballs go down. And we start with 1 meter to 2 meter infected, but we end up with a 35 meter deaths target. We can move the virus trajectory to a straight line by using log scales, and the cannonball to a straight line by moving to space. Now we're dealing with like and like, two straight line climbing trajectories, an exponential virus and a space cannonball. Now we can see that an exponential virus passes too high. We still have the infected versus deaths to address, but we'll do that later. But Ferguson's output is not exponential, it's normal. Normal curves have a nice cannonball-like arc on log scales, so for our metaphor we just need to reintroduce a bit of gravity, just enough to have the ball clear the 35 deaths marker, 35 meters high. In principle, we can increase or decrease gravity to clear any number of deaths up to a maximum of the exponential deaths after 69 days. Not even the government claims the virus is more aggressive than exponential. To convert from deaths to infected, we can do one of two things. Increase the target height using e.g. 100 infected per death, IFR 1%, for 35 over 1% equals 3500. Ferguson uses 0.9% IFR, so that would be 35 over 0.9% or 3889 infected. There's also the issue that infection would have to happen long before death, except apparently in the UK. The government reported deaths as occurring typically within 12 hours of diagnosis by case death lag at peak, but we'll pass over that here. Instead, we have to move back 7 days for case death lag and 7 days for an incubation period, with that much higher infected target. It's an interesting point that I never pursued, memo to self, check it sometime, as to whether Ferguson's growth could have cleared the 3889 infected target, but the easy way to adjust for deaths, not infection, is to move the canon forward 7 days for the incubation and another 7 days for the case death lag. What is this gravity for our canon? We, Farr and Ferguson all referenced normal contagions, Professor Ferguson in his figure 1a's shape, and a normal curve has a key feature. Its growth declines at a constant rate. It looks like a parabola. The sharper the curve, the steeper the decline in growth rate. So PF chose an angle and position for his cannon in January and fired at 14th of March deaths. There were no infections in January, not according to the government, and firing at deaths is not how to model the deaths curve. But the key thing is, choosing the gravity will decide the curve. Countries ignored by Ferguson with over 20 data points in cases sufficient to attempt a curve, which is rather more than the 7 data points he actually used in deaths. Why did he ignore all of these? These also include the UK and USA, his clients, and he ignored these curves for cases just as he ignored the completed curves of Hubei, China and South Korea. We show the reasonable projections he might have made for these countries had he chosen to do so. Notably, they will almost all tend to be far lower than the actual cases. As the most developed Western nation in COVID, with an excellent consistent growth decline, Professor Ferguson could have got an estimate of 50% or so of the actual height, maybe closer, with 2628 deaths at Hubei CFR, far better than exaggerating nearly 150 times. That's Italy. We annotate the chart to illustrate its features. For the UK, a reasonable estimate would again have been around 50% of the figure to peak and 2595 deaths, about 2/3 of the Hubei estimate and far higher than Korea. Again, not unreasonable. The USA was so early in its contagion that attempting to fit to cases data was absurd and generated an estimate far too low. Yet he claimed to fit to deaths whose data was even more sparse, deaths lag cases, absurd, and no one noticed. An annotated version of the chart highlighting the minuscule height of the contagion at the time. He claimed to be doing his modelling, and this is cases. Deaths had fewer data points and a minuscule 41 deaths or so to fit to. Singapore would have been way too low as an estimate, but ironically not absurdly so in deaths, with 9 versus 26 deaths by the end of June. Can you imagine living in a country with 302 deaths, UK population adjusted, a very similar figure to South Korea? So South Korea, ignored, wasn't a fluke. Japan, a country on a very low heat. The estimate would have been extremely low, but Japan's reality would have been entirely unacceptable to the UK government. We are not to be allowed Japan's 77 deaths, UK population adjusted. Germany again low, and notice that. A rational extrapolation of data led to low estimates, yet Ferguson managed to claim an estimate that was not just high, but absurd, at nearly 150 times a rational estimate from Hubei. Australia, again extremely low, and again, even so, we would not be allowed the 271 deaths, UK population adjusted, they achieved. Australia, victim to the Western agenda and propaganda, nevertheless a true Far Eastern death count. France, again low by what actually happened, but perfectly reasonable by Far Eastern standards. It's just that we weren't to experience what the other half of the world experienced. Canada, and again the price of attempting to project from an absurdly low and small set of data. The dashed projection is squashed at the bottom. Yet Ferguson's magical model claimed to be able to do this with such accuracy that its output would crush the world. Spain, and how's that for irony? The rare exception of a country whose initial surge suggested a far worse outcome than actually happened in cases. Its 72,000 UK population adjusted deaths would have seemed absurdly high, but the UK managed 41,000. Malaysia and back to a very low estimate and projected 17 deaths, but its final 121 deaths, 250 for the UK adjusted, would have been wished for by anybody in the West. Nobody made a phone call, nobody noticed. Iran and a well-developed initial contagion that wouldn't have been unreasonable if the contagion had stopped at the first bump, 14th of March. Instead it had a second surge. Remember, we're not trying to prove how good this approach is, but how risky it is from a slight data. Risky isn't absurd though. What Ferguson did was absurd. Thailand, again an extremely low estimate, but even so the UK would have loved to have had its real 58 deaths, and at 69 million population versus our 66 or 67 million, we don't even need to adjust. We were not destined to be so fortunate. Gauging the growth rate is important, but not nearly as important as gauging the rate at which growth is declining, as it does throughout a normal contagion. And since 1840 and Farr's original observation, there have been no exponential contagions, just normal contagions with their humped curves. Here we look at the sensitivity of outcome based on varying GDF growth decline factor. This is the equivalent to the gravity of our cannonball metaphor. Zero gravity equals 1 growth decline factor. Same growth today as yesterday, which is exponential. Typical gravity is 0.99 GDF. Growth today equals 0.99 times growth yesterday. We fix the growth rate to 1.15, Ferguson's doubling every 5 days. All of these curves have that growth rate, which shows the astounding effect of GDF, the growth decline factor of a normal curve, a concept that the government doesn't even acknowledge with its exponential virus. This is a piece of some beauty. I name it waterfall. The straight red line is what on log scales? Exponential. Exponential is a kissing cousin of normal, just has a GDF of 1. Normal curves have a GDF of anything less than 1, typically 0.985 or between 0.97 to 0.99. Choosing the GDF is choosing the gravity from our space cannon example. The curves are the curves available to Ferguson to hit the red dotted line, which is itself absurd. It's like painting by throwing a paintbrush from 5 meters away. Here's a range of curves from mid to late January, early January plus incubation plus case death lag, to hit the cumulative death total, top of red line, of deaths by March 14th. The curve is supposed to replicate that red line. Ferguson's scenario is absurd. In due course, even the exponential curve orange wouldn't have been enough to replicate actual deaths. This is not how you estimate the projected path of a contagion. It is, however, how Ferguson claims to have managed it. The critical feature of modelling a line is that your model ought to look like the line, just as our autofit normals look like the actual contagions, showing that they are a good fit. This is not a good fit. Lines going horizontal are not a good fit for a line going vertical. Ferguson's model has no business starting in January, yet no one noticed. In order to fit or hit the target deaths, we have to venture into levels of GDF that are absurd in real life. The dashed magenta line at 0.9988 is 99.88% exponential. In real life, a figure of 0.985 is far more common and 0.99 about the most extreme. A couple of reminders of topics not addressed by Ferguson and so outside the formal scope of this evidence. Professor Ferguson did not operate in a vacuum. His work was to promote the virus as a threat. The government's job was to demonstrate that threat. Yet at no point has COVID approached anything like the ordinary threat of being alive. In life, the single biggest threat to life is cancer, dominating most age groups except for the extremely old, circulatory, aka heart disease or related, and young to middle-aged, external causes or accidents. COVID didn't manage to exceed either of these. Why we're here. Massive threat, lockdown, wait for the vaccine. A vaccine that has proved more dangerous than COVID in Norway and in 30% of the world according to VAERS, the same CDC VAERS that has strange non-operational outages. Wrong news maybe? The black box model, understanding the logic of analyzing Ferguson by his output ICCRT R9 figure 1a rather than attempting to reverse engineer his code. We do not need Professor Ferguson's code, we know his output ICCRT R9 figure 1a. To understand why this is sufficient, consider what we call a black box machine, one where we can see only the output and later the input. If we see the input, then it should be reasonable in relation to the output. Cake ingredients going to make a cake. Car components or metals and plastics going to make a car. That makes sense. If the black box takes metals and plastics and turns them into cake, or sugar, flour and chocolate and turns them into a car, that makes no sense. Either it's a magical machine or there's fraud involved. Compaq successfully used the black box concept to mimic the output for every possible input of the IBM chip, and so created the IBM clone market. IBM soon left the business, unable to compete. The concept is legitimate and powerful. Inputs don't have to be identical, but they have to be rational. Two graphics chip black boxes drawing the same blue circle have different parameters, but they are rational and achieve the same result. Generating the same result, it's no surprise that we can find an easy translation between the two sets of input. If the input reflects the output, then that is rational. If the input does not reflect the output, then whatever the machine is doing, it is not providing a logical outcome given the supposed input. Thus, we do not need to know what code Ferguson was running. We only need to know his output, which was ICCRT Report 9 Figure 1a, with its curve and predictions of 510,000 UK deaths and 2.2 million US deaths. Critically, if we can replicate that output, in particular to peak, we can say that our model has the same effect, literally the same output. That being the case, characteristics of our output and figure 1a will be identical. Observing and proving that figure 1a is a normal curve to peak, we can apply a simple and standard method to generate a matching normal curve from a scaling factor, mean and standard deviation. The very act of doing so and producing the same output shows that we have mimicked his model. We realize that we can also generate a normal curve using a seed value for cases or deaths, a seed growth factor and a growth decline factor. This gives us a second method to replicate figure 1a. As with the graphics chips, Ferguson's claimed input, seed growth factor 1.15, doubling every 5 days, 35 deaths by March 14th, should be logically consistent with the output figure 1a. We have two methods to test whether figure 1a is indeed the output from the seed parameters. We can use them in our figure 1a clone black box to see what output occurs. It should match figure 1a. Or we can work backwards to see if the output figure 1a is consistent with the seed parameters set out in ICCRT R9. If the logical connection between the input parameters and the figure 1a output is broken, then the claim that the Ferguson black box generated that output based on that input is fraudulent. If there are multiple claims as to input, then each and all must succeed and be shown to be characteristic of the output. If any are not, then the logical connection is broken and the claim is fraudulent. Ferguson does not accurately specify the input for figure 1a, but makes two claims, one of which is reasonably specific, doubling every 5 days in early January, and one is more variable, 35 deaths by March 14th per the Metro report of deaths. Projecting forward from doubling every 5 days, 1.15 is a daily factor. A reasonable estimate is far below 510,000 UK deaths. However, it is possible to input parameters which will exceed the 510,000 UK deaths figure. A disproof of claim would require showing that figure 1a was not reproduced. Given that there is a range of parameters which could generate such a figure despite its unlikelihood, we would have to do considerable work to discount the scenario as fraudulent in every case. A much simpler approach is proof by contradiction. If the output figure 1a cannot have a growth rate of doubling every 5 days in early January, adjusted for infection death lag, then the output is not from the claimed growth rate. A critical feature is that Ferguson shows a normal curve to peak. The normal curve has a growth rate declining at a constant rate. If the growth rate of 1.15 occurs substantially after the claim date, it cannot also have occurred at the claim date. Early January by infections is mid to late January for deaths based on 7-day incubation and 7 to 14-day case death lag. Yet 1.15 does not occur as a growth factor until the 27th to 28th of April, nearly 3 months later. With Ferguson's output figure 1a reflecting a claimed January growth rate around 3 months later, the logical connection between input and output is broken. Figure 1a is not the output of any model using that seed growth rate. Since the output figure 1a is inconsistent with the claimed parameters of ICCRT R9, it is an artifact, an independent claim not connected to the science of the report. It is an artifact of pure invention, claiming a massive threat without foundation. That's it for this package. I'm Andrew Mather, a 60-year-old Brit, mathematician, financier, technologist, husband, biker, pilot, healer, whatever. Feel free to get in touch, andrew@peerlessreads.com or andrew@amather.com. Either should get to me.